Just a little clip from our last season. I just want to do a call out here for Larry Todd, who's actually a retired professor of archaeology at Colorado State, but he's now a research scientist here at UT. And he, primarily myself, have been doing this work through northwestern Ethiopia in these Middle Stone Age sites for the last several years. Well, when we talk about modern behavioral evolution, that it's an exciting topic because what it brings together in a way that really isn't there in the rest of my field of paleoanthropology is a diverse set of topics. So my area of expertise is mostly based on the fossil record, and here I'm talking very broadly. So not just the bones of the humans, fossils that we bring out of the ground, but also the faunas that they once lived with, often ate, interacted with, and also the geologic record too. We have lots of new data and techniques available to us for looking at stable isotopes as a way to monitor both climates and also diets. Certainly, the work on archaeology is critical here, that this is looking at changes in technology across time. And when we get into this interval from the Middle to Late Stone Age, we're looking at some technological innovations that have really changed the way that we think about modern human behavior. And it's a story also that has a timeline that's changing. One from what we thought way back in the Pleistocene when I was an undergraduate that was a very simple story to one that's actually more complex, and I think as a consequence more interesting. And we also have a story that's greatly informed by the work from molecular genetics. Again, this is something that for some of you it may seem like a very recent record. It may seem old to you. When I'm lecturing to my undergraduates about this, some of the most exciting work was published in 1987. Now, that work is now older than most of my undergraduates are. So if they've been doing this, they've grown up with that. But for myself, those are stories that we did not have when I was both an undergraduate, a graduate student, this is putting an age on me, and a beginning professor. So these are still new data as far as I'm concerned. And what's exciting with the genetics is that the acceleration there is just remarkable with the increases in resolution to that record. So I want to touch on 4 different things here today, and I also want to try to leave time for questions at the end in case you have any of those for me. So first, I'm going to do a fairly rapid skip across the advances in molecular genetics. What that provides, from my perspective, is really a roadmap for investigation. It tells us where we should be looking for these fossils, where we should be looking for changes in behavioral evolution. And I come down on the side where that's a very, very rich story. It's one that greatly informs our work with the fossil record. And when we're talking about modern humans, it's also a record that we can get at because the event that we're looking at, these migrations, are within the last tens of thousands of years. I've also done a lot of work on the evolution of early apes. There we're looking at data that go back 12, 14 million years ago, where the resolution of the genetic data is just not quite as precise. This is also a story that's informed by both new discoveries and new dates, so advances in dating techniques has helped us to better understand the fossil record. What we also understand now about the timing of these modern behavioral changes, what were thought to be a complete package is now unraveling with many of these behaviors occurring much earlier in the record than we had thought. And then finally, I'll talk about our new project in northwestern Ethiopia that aims to address some of these questions. So some of you may recognize this map. Certainly one of the members of the audience here will, just looking at the combination of data from mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome, which very securely, I think, ties the origin of modern humans to the African continent. And it's one that it just increases with its resolution, but it's one that points to our origin there, plus this migration out of Africa at a later point in time. Now, that migration out of Africa may not be as simple as this slide would portray. It may be that we're actually looking at multiple migration events of modern humans out, but it's only the most recent of those that actually took. The most recent of those that led to the widespread range of modern humans across Eurasia. So coming into the fossil record, that we have some new discoveries and new dates. So for example, the Omo material from southern Ethiopia, the Kibish Formation, has been known since the late 1960s. In fact, Carl Butzer, who's here at UT, just celebrated his 75th birthday. He was on the team that recovered this material in the late 60s. John Flegel and his colleagues a couple of years ago went back in, reworked the Kibish, and applied new dating techniques. And we're able to establish that a set of fossils that were thought to be maybe 100,000 years, maybe 120,000 years, actually push back to 200,000 years in age. So this is one of the most securely dated remains. Tim White and his group, Tim's at Berkeley, has uncovered modern human material from the Afar Rift, slightly younger in age, 160,000 or so. And these are among the very oldest representatives of modern humans within Africa. So these dates have been pushed back, not quite doubled, but almost doubled from the time I was an undergraduate about 25 years ago or so. That's remarkable, that there are few other events within paleoanthropology where we see dates doubling on points of origin. So this is an old slide that I just marked some of the Kibish. There are several specimens from there that we used to lecture with, and now this whole thing has slid back. So we're looking at a much earlier origin point. The record, too, is informed, as I'd mentioned, from work from geology, that this is a summary from a paper published 2 years ago by Schultz looking at lake levels within Malawi, and not just lake levels, but looking at lots of different proxies for the environments. And what this work and other works, too, have shown is that climates were not regular through the tropics, that we know during the last 2 million years, Earth's climate has been really run by glacials and interglacial cycles, but many ideas for the tropics were, well, there was some variation, but not a lot of variation. What this new work is showing is that the variation was marked. And if you look at the lake levels here for Lake Malawi around 120,000 years ago, what I've marked here is high lake levels. And you can see that on either side of this was a mega drought. These are the sorts of climatic changes that probably both would have served to fragment and bring early human populations back together and facilitate times of migration. So we have this event at around 120, and then you look at when things start to get wet again on the other side of this mega drought. This is around 70 to 80,000 years ago or so. So we may actually see then environmental controls for what we're witnessing, what we think we're witnessing anyway, within these early populations and the migrations. These are the sorts of data that we've been excited for a lot of years trying to pull together, but they're now starting to come together in a way that offers predictive models. We can go in and look at these particular time periods to see what's happening with the fossil record. This is a recent paper that looks at some of the high-resolution mitochondrial data. This was just published in 2008. And it goes beyond the simpler models from 20 years ago that simply look at a migration out, that these data are being generated now at the level of resolution where small subpopulation migrations can be evaluated and tested. And these are the sorts of data, when combined with the information that we have from environmental change, allow us to evaluate whether or not these kinds of habitat fragmentation actually also serve to fragment and isolate and reduce population levels. And then when habitats came back to a more equitable setting, that these populations could come together again. So we see this confluence of the data. But again, what it's pointing to is an African origin. And then we're looking at this out of Africa event at some point later on in time. And as I'd mentioned, this may actually be a two-step process. That one of the points that's always confusing for undergraduates with regard to modern human migrations is that we have this material from the Levant, from Israel, Skul and Kafsa, that on any measure is modern human. What's different about it is it dates to about 90 to 100,000 years ago. There's nothing else anywhere like that. And what appears to be the case is that there was, maybe on the shallow side of those two mega droughts when conditions were more equitable, a population of modern humans made it out, but they didn't make it out very far. And that with changing climates through the last 100,000 years, that population withdrew back in. We know Neanderthals came south. And it isn't then until equitable conditions are reestablished again that we see the migration of modern humans that actually stuck, the ones that went out across Eurasia and that all of Eurasian humanity represents today. So when we're looking at these migrations, we may be looking at multiple migrations. Now, with regard to behavioral modifications, this is the sort of slide that I was given when I was an undergraduate, that we see all of these different kinds of modern behaviors, many of them documented by the archaeological record, specific sorts of points, generally thought to be projectile points, the use of pigments, production of blades, bone tools coming in, fishing coming in. These were all believed to have occurred when modern humans came onto the scene. And when I was an undergraduate, this was thought to be at about 40,000 years, a suspect number because that's usually taken as the upper limit for carbon-14 dating. But it was really portrayed that we evolved, we originated because we invented ourselves by inventing these tools. And that's something in today's technology that we can understand, just how our behaviors can change so dramatically with the evolution of our technologies. What's seen, though, more recently is that these dates continue to push back and that we don't see them all coming together at once, but we see these different events being dated at different points through time. So rather than this, all of a sudden, this bubble occurring, what we see is a more gradual adding on of these sorts of behavioral complexities through time. And just to raise some of these points, for example, standardization, that these are some of the small points that we find all throughout Africa within the Middle Stone Age. And what's remarkable about these is that they're bifaces, so they're worked on both sides of the edge. Now, if you think about a knife that you use in the kitchen, and you're holding that knife, say, forget the handle. These things probably didn't have handles. There are ways to test that, though. It's usually a uniface, that you have a blade on one side, the top of the knife is dull. Good for cutting if you're just having to hold that. Would you really want to have a dual-edged blade implement for cutting? That if you're pushing down, the pressure that you're cutting that plant or meat with is coming right back into the palm of your hand. And it's been argued that the uniformity here and the small size of these may, in fact, point to projectiles. And that could potentially move the use of projectile points way back into the archaeological record. Bone points come into the record as well. Now, this is not an artifact of a preservational bias. We have bones going way back through the paleontological record. It's just that within Middle Stone Age, people figured out that they could make points on bone. And we start to see these things. And again, these are not the sorts of implements that you'd use to cut. There's some sort of a projectile, maybe on a spear, maybe with an atlatl, maybe even with bow and arrow. Beads also show up in the record. They're very easy, for the most part, to document. These are some that are made out of ostrich eggs. What this means with regard to symbolic behavior, labeling us versus them, is something that the archaeologists and social anthropologists can debate. But it's, again, something that we don't see earlier in the record. And it's not that it's a bias, again, against ostrich eggs or some of the invertebrate shells. We get those all the way back tens of millions of years. People start doing things differently within this period of time. When we think about the migration, and this requires accepting the origin for modern humans within Africa, there are several different tracks that have been suggested as possible migration routes. One is across the straits here of the Red Sea, and another is following the corridor for the Nile, coming up across the Nile Valley and then out across Eurasia. And again, we have a limited record, but remember that the school's SCOFSA material is right up in here, so it looks like it would probably be on this migratory track. The fact on the ground, though, is that there's been very little testing on the ground, recovery of fossils and sites that actually permit us to evaluate either one of those two hypothetical migration events. And that's some of the work that I'll talk about next. So when we think about the biases for the geologic record, when you hear about work within Africa, when you hear about work within Ethiopia, something like 95% of it is going to be based within the Rift Valley. And there are very good reasons for that. That we see the African continent rifting apart. Part of this is driven by the high plateau on the side over here and on this side, so that's a remnant of the rifting. With that rifting, we have sediments being shed down into the rift itself. Additional rifting with the tectonics there thrusts those sediments up into the air, which means it's a great place to find fossils. And this little slide here, this is one of our projects in Kenya, gives you some idea about what this looks like, that we're looking at habitats that are very dry, the rocks are very, very well exposed, and it's a great place to look for fossils. People have been looking in the rift valleys for much of the last century to recover this record. It's also the case, though, when you think about the plateau, and we know from new dating that the Ethiopian plateau, and this includes basalts also in the Saudi Peninsula over here within Yemen, were in place plus or minus about 30 million years ago or so. So we've had this high elevation plateau standing there in northeastern Africa for over 30 million years. Rocks go up, erosion brings them down. And one of the reasons we have such good sediments here within the rift is that these rocks have been shed down into the Rift Valley. In the late 90s, we decided that we would do something nobody else had done, and that was based on that same model, rocks go up, rocks come down, would be to look along the Nile tributaries in northwestern Ethiopia. Now the difference here is that this area of the lowlands of Ethiopia and coming out in Sudan is a stable craton. So far as we can tell, that craton has not gone up and it hasn't gone down for much of the tertiary. The large rivers that you see cutting across here actually are infillings of Mesozoic grabens. So you wonder about why oil is an issue in Sudan. It's because that these grabens, through the tertiary, contain very, very large inland lakes with high biological productivity. Additional fill within those produce the petroleum reserves that are now being fought over in Sudan. So this is unusual in that these are freshwater generated petroleum reserves, not marine petroleum reserves. So we have a record here of sediments. It's just that it's a different kind of a record than what we see within the Rift Valley. Well, to get up on here, it's a very different setting than what I showed you for that very arid area within the Rift itself. This is up at the Blue Nile Falls. This is Adam Gordon, one of my former grad students who's now a professor at University of Albany. The falls, this is often marked as the beginning of the Blue Nile. If you go there today, it's a beautiful place to visit. The difficulty is that the falls are dry. So Ethiopia has diverted the river off to the west here through a series of turbines, so it's hydroelectric generation at this point, not so much for flood control. IMAX did a movie some of you may have seen on the Blue Nile. They filmed it a couple of years ago, and they convinced the authorities here to turn the river back on. So if you go in and look at the Blue Nile movie, you'll see the falls roaring, but it was just flipping the switch, letting them film, turning it off, and going back to generate electricity. So this visit was one before they'd actually completed the hydroelectric facility. The other interesting thing about the plateau in Ethiopia, we're up at about 2,000 meters elevation, the rift is very, very low, is that it was the seat of the Ethiopian kings through the 1700s. So there are castles in Gondar that you can visit. That's if you're not leading one of these projects. I've been always too busy with the logistics and dealing with permits to actually get a day off to go visit the castles, but my students say that it's a great place to go visit. There's also one of our lunch spots, the Obama Restaurant Bar and Grill, that you can attend this too. You can see down below the Miss Obama Beauty Contest and Celebrity Cultural Show. And you may think in looking at these dates, so here's 11/2001, that the Ethiopians were omniscient about Obama's electoral victory. I mean, how could they know 7 years before he won that he was going to win and be president? Well, fact is, Ethiopia is on the Julian calendar, the church calendar, so they mark things as 7 years behind. And I can't tell you how much difficulty that gives me with UT accounting when I give them a stack of receipts that are post-dated 7 years. So on our way across the plateau, heading down into here, we stopped at an area called Chilga. So this is Lake Tana, the little blue spot in northwestern Ethiopia, a very shallow lake, in fact. And the reason we stopped here, it was the only spot published on the plateau that documented any sediments at all. And they were said to be 8 million years old. It was a small road cut. We stopped in there simply to ground truth our satellite imagery, to make sure that what we thought were sediments on our satellite imagery were in fact sediments on the ground. It turned out, yes, they were, but instead of being 8 million years old, they were 27 million years old. And we put in a project in here then looking at this fauna, and it's really a period of time of the missing years for Africa. The African record from about 23 to 24 million back to around 30 million is missing. We don't have any fossil localities through there. And the interesting part of it is that the earlier part of that record shows an endemic Afro-Arabian fauna. The younger part shows the consequences of a migration of Eurasian mammals into the continent. So somewhere within those missing years was this complete faunal turnover for an entire continent that we had not documented. And what we showed at 27 million years is that the endemics were still cranking through. We have a dramatic radiation of proboscidea. That's a lot of what you see here, our elephant teeth. And also the continuation of a lineage. This is our cynotheres, a primitive embrythopod, continuing through. If you looked at this thing on the side, it would look like a rhino. We think it was probably a proxy for rhinos, but we were able to document this missing mammalian fauna. Maybe the most interesting thing about Chilga, though, is its rich plant record. These are mostly reducing soils there, lots of lignites, and the plants are exquisitely preserved. So we're continuing this project. This is under the direction of Bonnie Jacobs, who's a paleobotanist at SMU. And you can just see some of the variety of the plants here, the beautiful preservation. In fact, the fungi that live on the bottom of these leaves, that did live on them, are still preserved in many cases. Lots of insect damage. We have lots of fossil forests. This shows a couple of tree stumps in growth position. Here are some kids on one down tree. The person back here is Mike Weeman from the U.S. Forest Service. He's an expert in tropical woods, so we've had him out to look at these. And then here are some of the trunks of some of the large trees. And this is not the smallest guy on my project for scale. This is truly an enormous tree. And it's a site that really measures up to what we see for the petrified forest in Arizona. And we've have been in discussions with the ministry there to set this up as a national reserve. We also, in doing this kind of work, keep our eyes open for everything that we have found. Again, on the plateau, a site, Kernet, that has tens of thousands of hand axes. This is a little hill here. The hand axes are all eroding out at one elevation level that you see here. We've trenched through this portion of the sediments, and this is just some of the take from some of this trenching through. Lots of fauna, and it helps to document, again, the life ways of early humans. This, we think, dates to maybe 600,000 years in age at high elevation. And there's just a handful of high elevation sites across Africa, again, because of the bias of going into the lower elevation Rift Valley. So anyway, continuing our work across into the border area, this is one of our gas fill-ups. It's unusual in that we're not having to mouth siphon the gas off of the roof rack down into the truck, so we actually have a little hand pump at this Shell station. We come off the edge of the plateau. As I mentioned, the plateau averages about 2,000 meters. When we drop down to the Sudan border, it's at about 500 meters. So you're dropping literally off the edge of this 1,500 meter cliff, coming down through 30-million-year-old basalts until you hit the flats. And that's what you're looking at here with Sudan just being right out there. This area, I don't think it's any trickier than a lot of the areas that I've worked, but it does have its issues. So for example, this is a shot taken from this last April. The border area, we've got a lot of light in here, but the border with Sudan comes up through here. This is our general study area. And this is a dust storm that blew across last May, so that you have some issues there. We're not out there in May, but I'm glad we aren't. And it's also an area that people wonder about. Oh, you're on the Sudanese border. What do you do for security? Well, I'm an old Boy Scout, so we're always prepared. If the local military authorities tell us we need armed escorts, we take armed escorts. So my kids think it's kind of funny that Daddy goes to work with guys hauling Kalashnikovs around, but I'll tell you, if I had these guys as backup at my faculty meetings, I'd get a lot more respect. Now, with all the vegetation that's in here too, again, it's not like the typical rift valleys where it's just denuded of vegetation. We get serious fires that come in. And in our years of going through the satellite imagery, some of these fires are enormous in size. This is one where we actually had to get through this, that it wasn't possible to go around the fire, we had to go through it. And I had this incredible driver, an Eritrean named Siyum, who literally you trusted your life with. And the fire had jumped the road here, and you can see it's just a gravel track, and the flames would come together like this as it burned up, and then it had used all the oxygen, and the flames would part. So we had the flames breathing across the road, and Siyum is sitting there. We're back several hundred yards, gassing it, timing it, gassing it, and just hits it. And so we punched through right as the flames exhaled and made it through this fire. It's not the kind of thing I would recommend. My poor parents have never heard this story, so I hope they don't listen to the webcast. This is a shot taken out the window by one of the students, not being able to believe the fact that we were in this. But fire plays a very important role in this setting and appears to have also through time. Today, we're able to use a variety of different measures of remote sensing to help our work. This is a digital elevation model where we're just looking at a couple of the rivers here, the Shinfa River and the Gongni River. The Blue Nile is much further down, but these are some of the major tributaries. Again, the border with Sudan coming across the side here. But we'll take anything as far as the imagery goes. So here's a shot courtesy of Lufthansa flying into Addis Ababa. It gives a nice shot of the lowlands here coming up into the plateau. And Google Earth is useful too. So when we're looking at surveying an area that's never been surveyed, that has limited tracks in it, we're quite limited, that we have to rely on satellite imagery to pick out where we want to work. And what these little stars represent are areas that we've identified as sediments. And then you can see the high plateau here of northwestern Ethiopia beckoning in the background. So coming into this, again, with the model we had, it really wasn't any surprise, but it was just nice that we were able to find sediments there. These are some very fine-grained sediments, probably a meander cutoff from one of the small rivers with some channelized cobble sediments above. Here's a little accessory channel that cuts down through. You can see the cross bedding through this. So we have a complex fluvial set of architectures across here that represent the history of these rivers coming off of the plateau. Now, it may look like our friend here is actually out harvesting grasses, but this is what we have to deal with in finding fossils. That this area is heavily vegetated because it has a very marked wet season that comes in the summer. So there's this incredible pulse of vegetative growth, and then when we're there in the dry season, we're still working through the remains. So we will go through literally on hands and knees. He likes to sit on his haunches, moving this dead grass aside, looking for the fossils. This is the kind of thing in dry badlands you do not have to do. We see a hummocky topography through here. Here again are fine-grained sediments. This is a fossil termite nest, so we'll find any fossils that we can identify. This fossil is from a genus that actually is found within dry habitat grasslands today. So we find these within these ancient sediments. This is a typical locality showing a mix of both lithics and also of fossil vertebrate remains, a bovid or an antelope molar here, a bit of a foot bone, and then some of the lithics on the surface. We identify these sites by surface prospecting, and then if they're rich enough, we go in and actually open them up. The sites there are also unusual in that they preserve, in some cases, conjoined elements. This is not common within the fossil record. So we have large antelopes and small antelopes. That little one is about this big or so. So we get a variety of these sorts of very well-preserved fossils. This is one interesting one that we found. It was way back in the bush on what was identified as a cutoff meander channel. And it's a water buffalo skeleton, but the skeleton itself doesn't have any limb bones with it. And that, at first measure, is a mark of human resource use, that humans will often come in, cut off the legs, and take them off. So we have the axial skeleton there, along with a beautifully preserved cranium. We have a hemimandible. So we have our own little bevo mascot here. And at this site, too, because these are very fine-grained sediments, it looked like it was probably ponded water, maybe again with a cutoff meander, that we found this track that appears to be a hippo track. But after too many days in the sun there, you rotate this thing around, I'll tell you, it looks like Charles Darwin's face. Now, for some of the sites, there again are some of our rivers, and just to show you a little GPS map that shows what our densities are, that we have tens and tens of these sites, archaeological sites and paleontological sites, within just a kilometer or less for radius. Every place we look out there, we find these sites, and that's not common for Middle Stone Age, especially to find sites in these sorts of settings that combine the lithic materials with the faunal materials. I'll just focus in on one of the sites here, SM1. This is it on the side with we've done this with remote sensing to do this kind of mapping. There are literally no maps from this area. And just some of the surface prospecting there shows remains with cut marks. So humans, we're cutting the meat off of these elements. This is a bobbed horn core here. This is a tiny little monkey. That humerus is about the size of your thumb or so. And it's an interesting point that they clearly ate this monkey, that it was found in a sealed site that I'll show you some other pictures of. It looks like it was burned. It may be some of the earliest evidence for utilization of monkeys as a food source. And it's a real question. How do you catch a little monkey? I've been in the field a long time. I've seen lots of monkeys, and I could never run one down. It's not possible. But when you think about it, well, maybe they just found a dead monkey. I asked my son, who's 9, how they might have gotten this. He said, well, maybe they stole it from a chimp who'd killed it. Good thought, just we don't have any chimps in here. Or it might be the kind of thing, again, when you think about those projectile points, that maybe they shot this thing out of a tree, but clearly utilized within the diet. So we've done some preliminary trenching at this site. We're going to open it up in a very serious way this coming January. And what we've been able to demonstrate is, yes, it is a sealed site, so this material is coming from one particular stratigraphic interval. We do that by looking at how big the bone chips are. Remember, with these big rivers coming down, it'd be very easy for that hydraulics to dissipate all of those bone chips or the stone chips. We find very tiny little flakes here, so that gives us great confidence that this is a sealed site, an active site that was utilized by these early humans. We find refitted lithics at the site, so we know they were making their tools right there. We can put these things back together. That's something, again, that could easily be winnowed away. So here's one of these retrofits. The pieces, when they hit the stone to break a piece off, the piece that's left behind is still theirs in many cases. So within these sites, too, we find a very large freshwater mollusks. This is some of the remains of that within the site, so we think they were probably eating mollusks as well. We see those living within the rivers today, and we find lots of fish vertebrae within these sites, too. So it looks like they were utilizing a wide variety of vertebrates and invertebrates. With regard to the points, this is, again, a typical bifacial Middle Stone Age point. These things are incredibly uniform, and they look to me like they were some kind of a projectile point. I'm an archer and a bow hunter, and one of the ways that we make sure that our arrows go in the same spot is to have arrows and heads of uniform size and weight. And that's what this is arguing for. If you're just using a tool to cut something up, it doesn't have to be as close to the same every single time. So it looks like there's projectile use going in, and we're this winter going to be analyzing the edges of these stones for residual adhesives to see if we can find any microscopic evidence of that. We also see heat crazing, that is a technique in stone tool manufacture where the raw materials are heated. We don't know in this case whether they were actually actively heated, if they were thrown in the fire after use, or they represent one of these big ground brush fires going across the area. But these are things that we'll be testing in the future. And we see a wide range of raw materials. These peoples were foraging far and wide to collect the raw materials that they were using for their tools. Other things that are just funny, that within that site, this is that little SM1, we find quartz crystals. These are tiny crystals, just a couple centimeters in length. They don't flake. You can't make a stone tool on these, and we now have 8 or 9 of these things there. Why were they collecting quartz crystals? These may be the equivalent of the Sudanese-Ethiopian border area ostrich beads. And so we'll be looking at these quartz crystals as well to see if these little bits in here represent adhesives that may have been used for a necklace. But they have no functional use that we can identify, but they were preferentially collected. Now, when we think about this area and just what the humans were doing here, that as I'd mentioned, it's an area that literally has not seen any work before. The U.S. actually had a Bureau of Reclamation team in there in the early 60s to evaluate the rivers for hydrologic potential and for farming potential. But we have to go back into the 1860s to Sir Samuel Baker and his wife, Lady Florence, to look at information about this area. And this is a long quote I don't expect you to read, but when Baker was doing this, and he was literally running head-on with Speck and Burton trying to figure out where the Nile originated, that they were an expedition that was based on what he could hunt and what he could fish. And they lived along these rivers. In the dry seasons, the rivers were dry. He documented that there were big water holes, but for the most part, the river was dry. And this is one great quote, where the rains had started on the plateau. It's dry as anything down in the flatlands, and the rivers come down like freight cars. And so he just says, the river's coming. They didn't know what this was, this uninterrupted roll of sound coming down, and the next day here's this river full bank to bank, 20 feet deep. So we see marked seasonality in this region, which left us thinking about ways that we could evaluate that in the past to see if this seasonality was also there when these early modern humans were there. This is one of these rivers. This is the Dinder River, a very large water hole here. And you can see it a little bit on the rocks down here, but on this close-up of the rocks, what we find are evaporation rings on the rocks along the river. You know, I've worked geology in the field. I'm trained also as a geologist for a long time. I have never seen this anywhere else, this extreme degree of evaporation. Bathtub rings on the rocks at every single pool. And what we decided then we could do is by sampling this water, we could look at the record for stable oxygen. That is, oxygen, as water evaporates, the O16 is preferentially evaporated out. So if you look at glaciers, they're rich in 16. 18 is left behind. We're not there through the whole year. In fact, we can't work there in the wet season. We're only there in the dry season. So we brought in one of our village heads. You can't see him here with our other colleagues, but these are his hands. We taught him how to sample surface water. And we also gave him a series of set of digital cameras. So every Sunday, he went down to the river for a year while we weren't there, sampled this little finger, pinky-sized vial of water, and took a digital photo to document, authenticate that he'd actually done that sampling. So you think about it, that he could have made his salary for the year in a 15-minute interval of time, and we'd have no way to know what it was. But Asafa is he's a great guy. He's worked with us for several years. When he was working the digital cameras, he'd never seen a camera before. He had a little bit of trouble starting out with it, but he documented some great things. And I circled this tree. I didn't point it out before, but here the river is bank full. And it's just coming down, again, like gangbusters here. These are our oxygen data that we ran for the year 2007. And what they show is this dramatic increase in oxygen 18 with evaporation. The rainy season there in Ethiopia is very marked, July, August, a little bit into September. When those waters are refreshed with the rivers coming down, the O18 level just plummets way down, and then it starts its evaporitic climb back up again. So Asafa is getting another year's worth of data for us. We're also sampling rainwater this year, so that'll be a very nice data set. But as this stands, we've got something like a 22 part per mil shift in O18. That's the most dramatic shift we've been able to find anywhere on planet Earth. So it's a dramatic record here. And because we can measure that from the enamel of some of the fossil bovids, some of the fossil antelope, very diverse faunas, we can evaluate the existence of this same system in the past. Most of the antelope that we have, this is the one, our bevo is right here, come out not terribly enriched in the oxygen. Again, this is a value that's averaged across their entire lifetime. But we have one little antelope out here that is very enriched in O18. So it looks like we may have the signal. And these are measurements that we can also get down at a yearly and potentially even monthly level. Another thing that Baker had noted, and this is during the dry season, that think about those hydraulics with these rains coming down just like gangbusters for that very limited period of time. They gouge out very deep water holes. When they evaporate out, they have these long water holes that continue to evaporate through time. And Baker talks about how he fished these, and he caught some tremendously large fish. He would also set up blinds next to the rivers and shoot the mammals that came down. So with regard to foraging, the idea here is that you don't have to go out far to forage in the dry season. You just hang out by one of these water holes. You've got the fish, you've got the mollusks, you've got the antelope coming in to drink. Why go anywhere else? Which is really a counterintuitive flip that for the most part we think dry seasons are the time of adversity. It's hard to make a living in the dry season. Here, what we're hypothesizing is this was the easy time to be around. This was a time when there was food plenty. So with one of these water holes, this is a little bit to the south of that archaeological site from last winter, the fish are literally in a bucket or a barrel. This is one of those water holes. Again, the slide's a little off here for you, but it's just fish upon fish upon fish. The locals know this very well. They set up fishing camps with trot lines through here. This is a very large catfish, about 3 feet long. I'll show you another slide that we study the ear bones of these guys. I asked him if he'd sell me just the head, if I could have the head, and he said, no, I can't sell this fish without a head. I said, okay, how much for the whole fish? It was about, 25, 30 pounds of catfish. It was $5, so we ate catfish, which is much better than goat for the next several days. But there's a great variety of fish within this. We thought we were doing good when we counted 7 taxa, 7 species. We later found an MA thesis from an Ethiopian student who'd spent time along these rivers. 22 different species are utilized by the local people. So it's an incredibly rich food resource.
How long does it take to grow a catfish like that?
We don't know for sure, but believe it or not, Texas Parks and Wildlife has a catfish specialist that we're meeting with who's going to inform us about all things catfish. So some of the other fishing techniques, the Gulms, tribal peoples, live in this area. The girls will go out with a piece of cloth with a little can of some meat remains, drop that in the cloth, sink it down, and catch the fish that way. They also build weirs for catching the fish, and we've also run into many locals who use bow and arrow to catch these fish. So it's a very rich resource, and we're thinking that unlike most of the conclusions about fishing, most archaeologists will tell you it's very complex. It's hard to find those fish. It takes special kinds of instruments, nets, hooks, you name it. It's literally just walking in here, wading in and catching the fish. It's very similar to what I did with my cousins when I was a kid on my grandpa's farm, that we irrigated all of our crops. They'd turn off the canals in the fall, so we'd get these big pools. My cousins and I would be shoulder to shoulder with pitchforks going through those pools, scooping out the fish. And that may be then one of these early behaviors that actually taught modern humans how to utilize these materials in a way that they then took with them once they migrated out of Africa. So with regard to the fish question, that we can look at the growth of fish through their ear bones. And that's what this little dissection shows here, with the fish pulling out the ear bones where they are. These are sectioned then. We can do counts, annular counts on them. Plus we can measure the isotopic data from both the extant fish in the rivers and the fossil fish, otoliths, to be able to see whether or not we're tracking those same sorts of isotopic changes through time. So the point that we're working on here, and it's just one of these to stay tuned with, is that one, we're in an area where nobody has ever worked before, looking at a utilization of resources that are really different than what has been hypothesized in the past. And it's because of the unique setting, seasonal setting here, of these rivers coming down through a limited point in time and then drying up. Most other areas, the rivers continue to flow. And if you're looking at a big flowing river, it's hard to catch fish out of that. The locals say during high times they don't fish. Why would they fish? They don't know where the fish are. They save the fishing for the dry season. And so the point here, and this comes off of Sam Baker's work too, that's on a Google book, so you can download it. It's really a tremendous read from the 1860s, talking about all of his time through this entire area, many of these same rivers that we're working today, is that this dry season then was a time of seasonal food plenty rather than food absence. And it was one that we think played a major role, potentially played a major role, in honing the behavioral foraging habits of early humans and staging them then for this exit out of Africa. But minimally, though, it will tell us give us a much greater idea, better idea about what the broad resource base was for these early humans. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is really one of the rare topics in anthropology within this greater field where we see this confluence of different techniques, different ideas coming to bear on a question. And for me, that's what makes this so exciting. When Paul Rayburn contacted me about giving a talk for you, he said, "Oh, can you talk about the work you're doing with Lucy?" And I said, "Well, you know, I could. We scanned Lucy here, and we're working on the high-resolution CT scans." I said, "You know, what you really want to hear about, I think, is this idea that brings in a variety of different sorts of evidence that is something that any one of your participants can pick on. That there's a piece here for all of you to work on this story, and it's an evolving story. It's a story, honestly, that's moving faster than we can keep track with it, and that makes it incredibly exciting for me to be involved with." So just thanks to our funding sponsors, National Science Foundation, the Ethiopian Ministry. This is a broad collaborative project with Addis Ababa University. We have many faculty members and students involved with us there, and then also to my home college here in liberal arts. And we have 3 minutes for questions if we stay on schedule. We think there is a hearth there, so we know that there are fires coming through, but this sealed site looks like they had a hearth. And there are ways that we can evaluate that sediments respond differently when they're cooked. And so one of the other things that I do, it comes out of my geologic training, is paleomagnetics. So my work is also in geophysics. So we can measure the magnetic susceptibility of these sediments to see what temperature fire they saw. And hearths differ because it's a concentrated fire. One of the things about wildfires is that they're extensive, but they're generally cool. They move fairly fast through an area. A hearth is a concentrated, very hot fire over time, so we can look at that difference. One of the set of samples we collected this last winter, we've got this fantastic cook who keeps us very well fed. We have an enormous Dutch oven that we cook our bread in, so it's underground. And so at the end of the season, I took a sample profile through his Dutch oven cooking area, up through the sediments and away from it to see what temperature those fires would actually see. We'll do that experimentally too, because these fires range across this area. Sometimes they're intentionally set. Other ones, like the one that almost burned us up, got away from them. And these fires come through, so we intend to lay out experimental burns where we'll lay freshly broken lithics on the surface along with bone, see what that looks like versus bone that we're actually intentionally burning in hearths. These will be some of the projects that our undergraduates and graduate students will be involved with. So it's a good question, and one that could really inform us about what these behaviors were at these sites.
Regarding the facet of this work that relates to climate change, that was interesting that I hadn't thought of climate change as the kind of impetus for people to get in the mood. But are there, what kind of applications are you or your students looking at for the climate change data? You know, you're gathering, I assume, from the geologic and the faunal evidence, and other things. You know, the fact that in what directions or what applications or what thoughts are y'all dealing with for climate change?
Well, you know, in this area, question on climate change, we don't know exactly where that's going to run, that the rains are very stable, that you're probably well aware that Ethiopia experiences lots of droughts as well, that for the most part those rains are concentrated, that it's rarely the case that the big rains don't come, it's just that they're sometimes much, much shorter, more attenuated. So that has big consequences for the downstream peoples. I guess one of the things that we're doing in collecting all of these extant data, so how the rivers are working today, what the wells in the area work, every time we find water, surface water, well water, we measure it to see what those changes are. There are big changes afoot, that this area is scheduled for very broad agricultural development. That back in the 60s, one of the reasons Ethiopia did not develop a big dam on the Blue Nile is that Nasser said if they did, he'd bomb it. What Ethiopia is doing today is developing thousands of small dams, more than the Egyptians can take out. So the Nile River's water pact with the surrounding countries is a very complicated legal issue, but Ethiopia is developing. And these areas that we're working are literally going under agricultural field cover. Many of these rivers are going to be dammed within the next decade or so. So we're at some level on a salvage project here, trying to get this work done before a lot of this disappears. But there are also opportunities that educating the local people about what the importance of these sites are, maintaining them through time. There's a new national park that's being developed just south of here, a joint park with Sudan. So we're expecting tourists to come through the area. So we're, again, advising the local ministry to set up some of these sites as tourist destination sites so they can understand what's going on in the area. We'll just see that even again for gathering the basic climatic data in this area, that the weather stations have only been in there for about 2 years, the central weather stations. So we just don't have a lot of background data. So certainly our isotopic sampling will add to that. And every time we find a dead cow out there, a dead goat, we knock the teeth out of it and sample those so that we have a longer record too of what these isotopic changes are like.
Sort of a larger idea of the movement of people. I was wondering if you could correlate some of the behaviors that have been found and also this extension of the fossil record to other locations with similar archaeological works.
Well, one of the interesting ones has to do with fishing. And you'd think that that was something that would be easy to document in the archaeological record. Fish bones are easily preserved. You go through many of these sites, it's, yeah, you know, we find fish, but are they generated by way of the humans or not? That the sites that we're working on, by and large, are within fluvial settings. Water has deposited those sediments and sealed that area. So many times we find lots of fish, but there's no evidence of human occupation with those fish. Fish also, if they're cut up, don't often preserve cut marks because, I mean, think about it. You know, how many times does your knife cut your salmon? Probably not very many. So butchery marks that we see on monkeys and antelope often don't show up on fish. So when we find some of these sites that we see a sealed site that includes fishing behavior, that's really interesting. And one of the points with fishing is that it appears to come in fairly late within the archaeological record. Now, with this migration of modern humans out, it's another idea there. How did modern humans actually make it out? Well, there's an interesting story. We can go into it later on, but it has to do with how vitamin D is generated through the skin. The fact is we move north, dark-skinned peoples are vitamin D limited because the dark skin suppresses that production. And so what's happened evolutionarily through time is that humans have lightened that skin. The other thing that's permitted us to take off into those northern latitudes is that we've added fish to the diet, generally marine fishes, but that's an independent source of vitamin D. So it might be the case that incorporating this sort of fishing behavior into a lifestyle actually facilitated that migration of modern humans into northern latitudes so that it could be a population that stuck. Now, with the earlier part of that record for northern peoples using fish, I've gone through all of that literature. It is mixed. There's no consensus on when people start using fish, except that modern humans are using fish. So we may see, again, not that they knew that eating fish gave them additional vitamin D, but that it facilitated those populations to stay. And the more important thing there for the calcemic functions of the skeleton, just keeping a robust skeleton so we don't get rickets, are the new data that show that vitamin D is an immune regulator, so it boosts our immune system. And those are very exciting data that have only really come together in the last 2 years. So that may be part of this larger story, too, of this northern latitude population that actually stuck.
I have one more question.
So you're saying, so you don't have any sort of physical artifacts to link to fishing behavior, like a weir, evidence of a weir, or?
Weirs, we don't have any at this site, but what usually comes in are little stones that look like they're weights for nets, that, you know, the net has to come down on top of the fish. There are hooks that come in later. Those barbed points are probably for fishing. But that evidence is all much later on.
What about a dense accumulation of fish parts that you would not expect to be together?
You know, even that, I mean, it's a bit tricky that for some of these in the catfish, and this is the case on some of the Congo, tributaries to the Congo, is that they spawn at particular times of the year and then they die. And so you get these fish accumulations that, you know, is it natural from the spawning, or was it a human refuse pile? And without the artifacts in there, it's very difficult to assess that. So that's where these sealed sites from lots of different locations are really critical for understanding this. And you know, again, our site here is going to be one additional point on the map. But it's, I think, a very important point because it looks at a range of behaviors that we have not documented previously. I know there's another talk, but I can hang out in the hallway for a little bit. So thanks for your attention.